So I'm here this morning with Reverend Sarah McKenney from Stonebelt, who I met earlier this week when I was visiting with Dr. John Kiesler. We had like a whole afternoon really where Sarah was showing us around Stonebelt, and then we really got talking about Sarah's role as where she offers spiritual support to people, adults with intellectual disabilities. So I was just really keen to talk to you today, Sarah, in a shareable form here, to talk to you firstly about Stonebelt and what you do, and then about your particular role there, because it's quite unusual, certainly from my perspective, but I understand it's actually quite unusual in the US as well. So yeah, tell us about you and about Stonebelt.
Yeah, so Stonebelt is a nonprofit service provider or agency that provides, and we are community based, and so I'll define that here in a moment. But we provide a variety of different support services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So that might be residential support, so staff supporting them in their homes, in their apartments, houses, throughout the community. And all of those spaces are integrated into the community, so we don't have like a separate neighborhood. And then we also provide a variety of different employment support services, helping people get jobs in the community or prepare for jobs. And then we have our day program that helps to kind of do some self-exploration and life skill building, social skill building. We also have like an arts program where artists learn different techniques and then are able to sell their artwork. And then we have our mental health division that is a mental health clinic that supports people with intellectual developmental disabilities and mental health diagnoses.
Mm.
My role is my title is spiritual support coordinator. So it's similar to a chaplain, but there are kind of some primary differences. So a chaplain at a hospital, or at a jail, or even in like the military, those spaces, the chaplain is the one that's providing the spiritual needs, or meeting the spiritual needs. They are kind of those folks' clergy for that time being. My goal is to actually almost be a spiritual case manager or connector, so that I help people figure out what their spiritual needs are and then connect them to the community so that they're getting those needs met, but out in the community so that they're finding those natural connections.
Nice. And also you don't have whilst you're ordained from a Christian church denomination, you have a fairly, so we were just talking a minute ago, you were saying about, it's your understanding that everybody inherently has a spirituality, whether they're maybe aware of it or not. Can you say a bit about that, like about your understanding of how people would access that and how you sort of draw people into?
Yeah, and you're right. So while I'm ordained within a specific Christian denomination, I really support people of any and all faith traditions, but also spiritual practices.
Yeah.
And what I guess I mean by spirituality or spiritual health, that like you're saying, that I would argue that every human has, whether they use that language or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
Every human has a need to feel a sense of purpose,
Yeah.
have a sense of value in their life, that they carry a sense of value and are worth something, that they have meaningful connections and relationships, so love, that they're experiencing joy, uh, even the concept of we all kind of have to figure out what our morals or ethics are.
Yeah.
And I would argue people of any and all intellectual abilities are figuring this out in some level and to some degree. Um, and then also just kind of, I also call it the big questions category of spirituality, as we're all kind of navigating, is there a God? Isn't there? What is my relationship to you? I'm different from you, but we are still relational, and there's still that
Yeah.
need to be around other people. What
Yeah.
is that connection? What happens after death? Um, what is humans' connection to the earth? And again, this sounds very intellectual, but we do this in ways very naturally, and things that we don't really, we do this in our movement or in our actions every day with one another and with the world. We just may not be aware of that intellectually, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And you know that the most of my work is with young people and adults who have maybe would be classed as having a more severe intellectual disability, and often people who have no verbal communication. So how, like, have you had any experiences where you felt like you've supported somebody who maybe doesn't have any spoken communication, and there's but that you've been able to identify or work with them on a spiritual practice, or finding their spirituality?
Absolutely. And if now is a good time to tell that story.
Yeah, please do.
Um, I have worked with, and I will say each person, it's really about spending time with each person and really getting to know who they are and kind of what makes them tick,
Yeah.
and what kind of brings certain responses out of them. Um, and that doesn't take, that's, you can't do that quickly. That takes a lot of time, and a certain amount of mutual vulnerability of
Mm.
me entering into their space,
Mm.
while still maintaining, of course, professional boundaries, but a certain amount of vulnerability of allowing them to really teach me. Um, so there is a woman that I met with about 5 years ago, and just to start out, I knew that she doesn't use words to speak, and she is deaf. Um, but I also knew that there were a few things that people already knew that she did like. And one of the things that she liked was being outside in the grass. And so I just joined her one day, and I um, was uh, so she went ahead outside and spent some time in the grass, and I kind of gave her that time to get settled and be in that space. And then I started to enter that space, but still keep my distance so that she could see me and see that I was in that space, or approaching her space. And then but observing.
Yeah.
Then and then I kind of, after a while, I came closer and started enter her physical space, and sit down in the grass with her at that point, all while watching her. Um, and I'm watching her to make sure, because I'm starting to enter her space. So
Yeah.
I'm watching her almost to ask permission, right?
Mm.
Um, so that and also learning whatever language I can get from her, so that
Yeah.
if her body language starts to change, I'm getting a sense of those changes as I enter into the space,
Yeah.
and kind of continuing to assess and look for any sign of communication. Um, so she looked at me and kind of acknowledged that I was there, but then kind of went back to what she was doing with the grass. And then I started to kind of mimic her or copy her. And at that time, she was combing her fingers through the grass. So I started to do the same. Um, And then there was some looking up to double check what I was doing and kind of assessing what all I was doing. And then pretty quickly, she scooted closer to me
Nice.
and started to correct me. I was apparently combing the grass incorrectly. Um, and then this is when the teaching really began, and she began teaching me about her space and about the grass. And she started to do that by first, she showed me. So if this is the grass, she started by helping me tickle the tips of the grass
Wow.
on my hand. And then apparently, again, I was doing that incorrectly. And I don't know if people are familiar with hand over hand method of helping, but she used hand over hand method with me. And she
Wow.
took my hand and she showed me how to tickle my hands correctly. And she was correct. It tickled and I laughed out loud. Um, and then and constantly also making eye contact with her to continue to assess, because I didn't, making sure that there is no overstepping in any way,
Yeah.
and watching for that communication. Um, and then at some point she um, showed me kind of the next thing, the next way to interact with grass, which is combing the fingers through the grass. And
Wow.
again, I tried it, she watched, she didn't think it was correct. And so she showed me again how to do it correctly. Um, and this continued. The next was really getting a feel of the solidness of the ground itself and the
Yeah.
dirt. And she started to pound on the ground while looking up at me at this point, like waiting for me to follow. Now your turn. Um,
Wow.
and so she'd look at me and wait, and then I would do it. Um, and then, again, I I'm a bad student, because again, she would show me how to do it correctly. Um, and just allowing her to really just teach me. Um, so she really taught me about the solidness of the ground and how different that was from the light tickling on the hand, and that all of those different experiences came from the same space.
Mm.
Um, and then this led to completely changing our body and our body's interaction with the grass. So now she laid down, and she laid down, and then she looked up at me to make sure I was doing the same and waited for me to lay down. I wasn't getting it, and so she like put her head up again to like signify, come on, let's lay down. Um, and so then I followed and I laid down, and I think she even put her hand on my shoulder to like,
Mm.
come
Wow.
on, trust me, come on. Um, and so then I laid down and we stared at each other through the blades of the grass.
Wow.
And she showed me how to roll around in the grass, kind of make snow angels, sort of grass
Yeah.
angels, I
Yeah.
guess. um, and just move in so many different ways, whole body movement
Mm.
in the grass. And then again, it ended. We kind of had these different moments sporadically, but especially at the end, of just staring at each other through the blades of the grass. The whole process took about 2 hours,
Wow.
and it really was. I learned so much from her
Yeah.
um, that has completely shaped my own theology, my own spirituality,
Yeah.
but also just, also the academic world of doing my job,
Yeah.
practically doing my
Yeah.
job. I
Yeah.
just learned so much from her. Um, and it was truly an honor to enter into that space and be her student.
Mm.
Um, a, a I don't know if I've ever been so honored to enter into that space with her. And I don't think there's ever been anyone that has been willing to do that with her, which is a shame.
Mm.
I would categorize that as her holy place and her spiritual practice.
Yeah.
She may not use the language in her head as God explicitly. Um, and I don't want to use that language for her.
Yeah.
But I do want to name that there was something sacred. And what I mean by sacred as is kind of extra special that holds very significant meaning to her.
Mm.
Um, and and kind of resets her and grounds her.
Yeah.
And that's more than, I was told by a lot of people, oh yeah, she loves it. It's very sensory stimulating for her. I felt like it was more
Yeah.
than a sensory
Yeah.
toy
Yeah.
tool.
Yeah.
There was something significant. I mean, she became the teacher who teaches somebody else about a sensory toy.
Yeah.
I mean,
Nobody.
there was a no. There was a way in which that she was actually teaching me about the earth and the ground and nature. Um, and that meaning, that depth is hard to intellectually describe. Um, but that is what I would call spirituality and spiritual health. And we all do that
Yeah.
in different ways. It might be through a faith community, but it also may be laying in grass,
Yeah.
in a book club, so many different things.
Yeah. And do you know what? If you heard someone talk about, well, where I meet with God most keenly is at the top of a mountain, you wouldn't
Mhm.
even think twice, would you?
Yeah,
You'd be like, of course, that makes complete sense. A lot of people meet either their God or have spiritual experiences in nature. But what you're describing is a level of expertise from this particular lady who doesn't need to go up and look at, thousands of miles of view, but she
it's
understands that
saying
it's
right
right
here in
here.
my front yard.
Absolutely. And then I think as well, like what some of the other theological ideas around nature, where it talks about the whole earth, in the Christian faith, it talks about the whole earth lifting a sound. And we know that like grass does sing, that that when the wind blows through the grass, it makes a singing sound, but it's so quiet that we don't tune into it. But she probably has tuned into all of the different ways that just the grass is an access point for her for spirituality, and like how extraordinary that she has not just, but the thing that also speaks to me about spirituality is it's not just her access point, like some kind of private spirituality or faith, but and I think that the thing that resonates with me about this being a spiritual practice is that she wanted to share it with you. And spirituality has this dualness typically, doesn't it? That there's like there's like a vertical stream between us and God or spirituality, but there's also this horizontal track where we share it with those around us. It makes most sense within a community space and within a group of people where we come into some kind of shared understanding.
Right, right. There's this need to, and that goes kind of to the nature of humans, where we are connectors, we are
Yeah,
relators. I
yeah,
mean, even people who are introverts or don't like a lot of people,
yeah,
there's still that need for some form of connection with others.
yeah,
Um, uh, it may be in a specific kind of space or atmosphere, but there's still this real need to connect with others. And I also see that as how what she was also doing with the grass. It's kind of like what I was saying of there's this we explore kind of where are we at with the rest of the world and what is that relationship, where it looks like. And
Mm.
I think that's also what she was doing in the grass, is she is seeing what the difference between her body and the earth and what is outside of her body, and what's that relationship and
Yeah.
how do we interact with it. um you know, you can go the intellectual theological route of kind of explaining that in fancy words, or you can do what she's doing, which is physically exploring that with her body.
Yeah,
um,
absolutely. Yeah.
and so she's still doing that. That's why I say we kind of all do that. All humans have a way of doing that, whether or not we're really intellectualizing that. um, we're still trying to navigate who we are, um, in the world.
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So this, so I'm thinking about how this then translates into your like I guess your work and your like ordinary interactions. And I think where we met where in the common room where there was a lot of different clients and service users who were in this space. And so I got to see um how they interacted with you and how and I guess um there was this, for me, as I watched your relationships with each of those individuals, there was this common thread of just a mutual respect between with you and everybody that you interacted with, and and a and a determination to see the person and treat them with dignity and with equity. And I really enjoyed that. I felt I was so pleased that we had our conversation in amongst those that you know, that we were talking about the sorts of services that we're providing, the sort of ethos that you guys were using, but then I got to see it in practice. Um, and I know that part of your job is that you and with a colleague also lead the trauma informed piece of work. So how do you see, because trauma informed models, certainly the ones that I've been looking at, don't tend to have an explicit spiritual support element to them, but I know that you feel like it's implicit in trauma informed care. So how does that link up together for you?
So, um, yeah, so I feel like in our I'm going to start with kind of a vague answer to start.
Sure.
um,
Good.
uh, so just like in spirituality, our morals, our ethics, kind of what makes us tick, what drives us, um, those things, those spiritual things, aren't really a separate category in our lives. They're
Mm,
ingrained in everything that we do, in the
mm.
decisions that we make, in what we're kind of called to do in our lives, in the responses that we have with one another, and how we choose to relate to other people. It's more ingrained in everything that we do versus kind of a separate thing.
Mm.
Um, so same goes here. So all of those things are kind of ingrained in trauma informed care. You and I talked a little bit about, and I can actually pull it down, I have it on my wall, um, about the belonging wheel,
Yeah.
um, that Eric Carter has created. And I can pull up the visual since I didn't prep it for the computer, but this is the visual,
Nice.
and you start with being present um, at whatever it is that you're trying to be a part of.
Mhm.
Then hopefully you're invited, which means now the community is asking you to be there. You're welcomed. Eventually, you're known and accepted. Then you're moving into starting to support one another. But this still can be a little one-sided. Being supported can still be kind of a one-sided relationship.
Yeah.
But then when you're being heard now you're starting to move into a mutual relationship.
Yeah.
Then befriended, needed, and loved.
Mm.
And once you're at that point, people need you to be there. The space is not the same without you.
Yeah.
We need you to be here because you're a part of this group.
Mm.
Um, and then being loved. So that is, and I see all of those methods, and that really to be true for trauma-informed care. So you look at like the seven or the principles of trauma-informed care, and you look at safety
Mm.
and communication,
Mm.
all of those are right here. Communication is how you feel like you're actually being heard
Yeah.
and accepted. Being emotionally and physically safe
Mm.
is being welcomed and help, so then it allows you to be known and accepted and befriended, because you're actually able to slowly, everybody's able to slowly be vulnerable, communicate truthfully, cooperate with one another, and that communication is really open in building all, and this is not just for people with disabilities. I mean,
Yeah.
Eric Carter originally created it in hopes to teach people about how to be more inclusive of people with disabilities. But this applies to anything.
Yeah.
And one of our relationships goes through this process.
Nice.
And same with trauma-informed care. If there's not a sense of trust and the relationship's just one-sided and very authoritative, you're not going to feel safe.
Yeah.
There isn't that trusted communication that my opinion matters.
Yeah.
So it's going to quickly feel like a toxic space. Past trauma is going to be easily triggered.
Mm.
And so building these kind of mutual relationships where everybody feels like they are a part of, um, you know, if I'm talking about Stone Belt and trauma-informed care within Stone Belt as an organization, if everybody feels like they belong,
Yeah.
then they're also going to feel safe, and there's going to be a decrease of past trauma triggers,
Yeah.
and prevention of future
Yeah.
trauma,
Yeah.
or big trauma or little trauma. And even past trauma triggers, then the community still knows how to support you when you are triggered, when that does happen. And so those spiritual health elements are really about connection
Mm.
and tuning in with one another and taking the time, and not just focusing on like certain objectives, but looking at each other as other human beings.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and you can see as you're describing it how like dignifying and somebody's spirituality is completely in line with the trauma informed principles and
If you're
enhances.
doing trauma-informed care principles, you're supporting their spiritual needs
Yeah.
innately.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other things I noticed when I was with you that really has really stuck with me is that the language that you used around people and people's spirituality was uh, again was dignifying and was validating. So I think you introduced me to a lady who's going to be helping with the children's church this coming Sunday. And she was, she was explaining to us that this is what she wanted to do, and and you'd helped her to find a community that would bring her into that. But as she walked away, I think you turned to me and you said she feels called to this work, and she feels called to help children pray. And it really stuck with me because there was not one hint of like, this will we're doing this for her good, or that this is, you know, that any hint of patronization, or like, well, this will be a nice thing for her to do and she might make some friends. You like, what you were telling me was, this woman has something to contribute that's part of her spirituality and part of her sense of call in the world. And it just, yeah, I've just been reflecting on that really, and how the reason it stood out is because it's unusual, and it shouldn't be unusual. Because why should she have any less to contribute than anyone else in the world? But there is a difficulty with people. So back home in my church, we have a lot of people with neurodiversity and intellectual disabilities as part of the community. But it takes some kind of mental shift to understand that they are not primarily in the community to be looked after and to be helped, but to make a contribution the same as anybody else.
Right.
And I think that piece of that shift in our mentalities is so important, because it helps the person to feel heard and seen and
Right.
known, and that they belong, rather than that
Right.
they are, you know, they're not primarily taking, they are giving and taking the same as everybody else.
And it's that, so if we can all agree, I think most people would pretty quickly agree without going too far into it, but first off, completely agree, every person has purpose.
Yeah.
Then you get into, what does that purpose mean?
Yeah.
And I think all too often we're quick, the purpose for people with disabilities, or presumed purpose for people with intellectual disabilities, is just their mere presence is purpose enough, because
Right.
it's a reminder of our diversity or whatever.
Right.
But there is no action, or there's a word that I'm looking for that I can't think of, but there's no action required by that person. It's just you're just existence.
Yeah, they're not expected to contribute.
Yeah. It's this so there's no real active participation in the relationship, or in their existence of being here. So, you know, I don't think that. I think that people have more to offer than just I'm here, than they're physically being present.
Yeah.
So if we can agree on that, then really every person has their own vocation and call.
Nice.
And it's my hope is to help people figure out what that is. And then being able to live and carry that out, however that might be. So and we do have, so we're piloting this program for the state of Indiana, in hopes. So we have a Medicaid waiver service here in the States, which helps to pay for a lot of like funding for programs for people with disabilities.
Nice.
And in this state, and a lot of these programs are kind of decided by state as far as what Medicaid supports or not. It might be federal money, but each state kind of chooses how to use those federal funds.
Okay.
And so we're piloting this program for the state of Indiana, and taking kind of what I've been doing and seeing if this can be a Medicaid waiver service that any service provider in the state of Indiana could pick up.
Amazing.
And in that, we have spiritual engagement coaches, and they do kind of what I was describing. We'll move through a 4-step process. The first step being self-exploration, and helping the individual really explore who they are, what they believe, what makes them tick, what drives them. And this is people who are speaking and non-speaking. And then, and for some, they're really doing this for the first time, right? So up until this point, they may be doing what their parents have said or guardians have said, or team who is telling them, you would really like this.
Right.
Um, uh, but they're not actually given time to really think about what's at their core and what really drives them and what they really want.
Yeah.
Um, and then second phase is to do community discovery. So to rediscover what is in your community, what all it has to offer, and look for connections between that what happened, what was discovered in that self-exploration, and how that connects to the community.
Nice.
And then third step is to try and get involved in one of those communities. So if it's a faith community or a book club, because we've got a guy who's thinking about starting a book club because he is such a theologian and a philosopher. He loves to ask questions, and has this fascination with kind of what happens after death and kind of this existence beyond this world. And so he's trying to start a horror book club, as horror books kind of are the jumping off point to some of those discussions.
Yeah.
And so then meeting more people to then jump off and have those exploratory discussions with. We have another woman who's she's going to start as a Sunday school aide and help teach kids how to pray, because that at the core was what she felt was most important to her in her call.
Wow. I love that.
And the list goes on of secular non-religious things to people who have chosen kind of religious traditions. And then the fourth step is, after building that community and relationships, is actually encouraging that community to take on the support role. So the community members, their new friends, are offering transportation. They're present with them, so that we're decreasing the presence of paid staff as much as possible, and trying to increase natural supports, those friendships. Because so many people with intellectual developmental disabilities are constantly surrounded by people who are paid to be with them. And we want to increase those real natural friendships.
Absolutely.
To provide opportunities for teaching and taking the lead, and really and really diving into their spiritual health.
Wow, I love that, Sarah. It's just it's just such beautiful work that you're doing, and pioneering really as well. And the threads, how all of that links into like trauma-informed care, which is right at the heart about lifting people back into equitable relationships, and being understood as people who have something to contribute, something to offer, and helping to make sure that they come into spaces where they belong, which is what you've been
I mean, we really try to decrease any sort of power dynamic. So, I mean, we're really infusing. I mean, the program just naturally infuses trauma-informed care principles, because we are trying to decrease any sense of power dynamics that already exist between people with disabilities and staff. And trying to say, no, you are the teacher. I am merely here to listen and absorb, and then help you find where your connections lie, or where those opportunities lie. And so by doing that, it's been so much fun, and so humbling to watch and learn from each individual. And I don't know how often I hear from coworkers, I didn't think that she could do that. Or oh, I underestimated him.
Mm.
I hear that all the time. And it was like, yeah, we underestimate a lot of people.
And I think this is the other part of this, and when we take these frameworks and lenses for the work, isn't it, that it switches the whole thing up so that we're not just people, the professionals are not just people who are giving care, who are taking care, who are like, when you do find those and it's not easy to do when you do even have those moments when the power equalizes, then then it totally shifts the work round and the meaning of the work for the professionals, because they have moments when they learn, when they're inspired, when they're enriched. And I think a lot of us came into this work in the first place because not because we wanted to primarily give out and give out and give out, but because there was something deep inside us that believed
Right.
I think my life could be richer from being around people, who have some differences to me, who I'm going to need to work to understand sometimes, but that there's something beautiful about finding those times of mutual interaction and mutual understanding. Yeah,
Ultimately, it's a huge practice of releasing control.
yeah,
I mean, really, at its core, is really as far as a staff person, uh, it's a constant practice to stay present, push aside any need to control, and what I mean by control is trying to ensure safety, trying to direct or move things quickly or under certain speed, um, and to try and just push those expectations constantly, a reminder to push those expectations aside.
yeah. And of course, the continual practice of relinquishing control and understanding what we're not in control of is in and of itself a spiritual practice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I do feel like it becomes easier when you are, especially when you're given those opportunities for
Yeah,
those positive stories to
yeah,
emerge. It's hard when you have to kind of move through some of the tough stuff to get
yeah,
there.
yeah.
Because then that's when we want to naturally try to tighten. Um,
Well, we
uh,
initially feel frightened, don't we? When we give up control,
mhm.
we initially feel terrified, because what happens when I'm not completely controlling is this person going to be safe if I don't control their every move and decision? So I think we have to face the fear, and then we go into these spaces where there's a kind of mutual exchange and a richness that comes out of that in the interactions.
And we do that with one another. We'll tell, our friends or our colleagues, well, it's okay, like it didn't go that way as planned, but you have to learn about you have to go through failure to learn. And so
Yeah,
we say and support one another, but then we don't do the same with people with disabilities.
yeah,
Anytime they have any sort of trip up, it's, oh, okay, so maybe we shouldn't do that again.
yeah. That's true. That's true. They're not given the opportunity of failure and mistakes, because we're just in a much more punitive environment.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Oh, that's been so interesting, Sarah, just to hear to hear what you're doing and how that all links together into these trauma informed care and those principles of working. Thanks so much for sharing that with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity.